Good morning, everybody. We are starting today with Shrimad Bhagavata Mahapurana, Book 11, Discourse 19. We are in the middle of the Uddhava Gita. The next discourse is called A Dissertation on Devotion, Spiritual Enlightenment, and Yogic Disciplines in the form of the 5 yamas, the niyamas, and so on. And this is, of course, Krishna talking to his good friend Uddhava. The glorious Lord began again. He who is equipped with learning culminating in intuition, who has realized the self and does not take his stand on mere logical reasoning, but direct experience, should know this world of differences to be a mere phantom appearing in me, and eventually relinquish this knowledge too. This is what is technically known by the name of Vidvat Sannyasa. To a man of wisdom, I am the only beloved. I am recognized to be his purpose and goal, as well as the means of accomplishing it. I am his heaven and moksha too. No object other than me is dear to him. Only those whose mind has been thoroughly purified through knowledge and realization of the self are able to know my supreme state and glory. The man of wisdom bears me up with his knowledge, hence he is most beloved of me. Ascesis, resorting to sacred places or holy waters, the muttering of prayers, charity, and other purifying agencies do not consummately bring about that perfection which is wrought by a ray of knowledge. Therefore, knowing your own self up to the stage of realization, O Uddhava, and equipped with knowledge and realization and full of devotion, worship me. Having worshipped me, their inner controller and bestower of the fruit of all sacrifices, in their own self, sages have attained to me alone in the form of highest perfection. This threefold modification that crops up in you, O Uddhava, is only an illusion, and that it appears in the middle and does not exist in the beginning or at the end. And he's about to explain what he means by that. When these 6 states, birth, existence, growth, transformation, decay, and death, befall this psychophysical organism, nothing happens, no change comes to you, the substratum, which is beyond and unaffected by these states of the body. What persists before and after a phantom also exists in the middle. So in the classic Upanishadic teaching or example of a rope mistaken in the dark for a snake, the experience of a snake exists only in the middle. Beforehand, it was understood to be a rope. Afterwards, it is understood to be a rope. But the reality of the rope persists the entire time. Even when mistaken for a serpent, there is still a rope. But when not mistaken, there is no serpent. And so what is meant by the world or the body not being the self, or the world not being real, is that the world is real in a sense. The body is part of you in a sense, but so fleetingly. It only exists in the middle. It is only as real as the serpent in the mind. It is not the reality that precedes and exists beyond it. It's just like a fleeting phenomenon. Uddhava submitted, please expound in a thorough way, O Lord of the universe, which is your own form, this purifying and most ancient wisdom, coupled with dispassion and intuition, as well as the path of devotion, sought after even by the great, Brahma and others. For a man tormented on all sides with the threefold agony, agony brought about by natural calamities, agony inflicted by other living beings, and agony arising out of bodily distemper or mental disturbance, and undergoing intense suffering in the fearful path of metempsychosis, O Lord, I find no shelter other than the umbrella of your feet, which not only afford protection against the scorching sunshine, but also rains nectar on all sides. Kindly lift up, once for all, this creature fallen deep into this abyss and bitten by the snake of death, seized with the great thirst for trifling delights of the senses, and soothe me with nectar-like words showing the way to liberation, O Lord possessed of immense glory. The glorious Lord replied, thus did Raja Yudhishthira, who bore no enmity to any creature whatsoever, ask this question in the former days of Bhishma, the foremost of those devoted to the righteous course, while all of us listened. Having heard the exposition of many righteous courses, when the war between the Bharatas had come to an end, Yudhishthira, distressed over the death of his kinsman, subsequently asked Bhishma about the courses of conduct conducive to emancipation. I shall reproduce to you the exposition of those righteous courses, which was heard by me from the lips of Bhishma of heavenly vows, and which is full of precepts on spiritual enlightenment, dispassion, intuition, faith, and devotion. Jnana, or knowledge, has been concluded by me to be that by which one is enabled to perceive the nine. The nine being Prakriti, Purusha, Mahattattva, Ahankara, and the 5 Tanmatras. The 11, which are the 5 senses of perception, the 5 organs of action, and the mind. The 5 being the gross elements, and the 3, which are the 3 gunas. As permeating all created beings, from Brahma, the earliest and foremost of all created beings, down to the merest blade of grass, and further perceives the One, the intelligent principle, the Supreme Spirit, running through them all. When, however, a man no longer perceives, as he did before, the many as permeated by the One, but sees that one reality only, that alone is vijnana, to be sure, the experience of complete transcendental consciousness. In order to perceive this one reality alone, he should ponder the coming into existence, continuance, and dissolution, the transitoriness and unreality of the many existences constituted of the 3 gunas. That alone should be concluded to be real, which abides at the beginning as well as at the end, and follows from one evolute to another in the middle, and again which remains as the residue in the process of their involution. Of the many pramanas, which are means of knowledge, Sruti texts, direct perception of an effect being invariably produced by a cause, tradition, and inference. These 4 are the most authoritative. Plurality of substances not finding support in the light of these, a discerning man realizes the spiritual substance permeating all phenomena to be the only reality, and recoils from diversity in the form of this world of matter. Since all ritual acts are transient, a wise man should look upon even the invisible world, including the realm of Brahma the Creator, as full of misery and perishable like the visible. The path of devotion has already been delineated by me. I shall, however, tell you once more the royal road to devotion, since you have developed a liking for it, O sinless one. Keenness to hear my nectar-like stories, repeated exposition of my stories when they have been heard, intense devotion to worship, and glorifying me with songs of praise, enthusiasm in doing service to me in the form of sweeping my temple and so on, saluting me with all the 8 limbs, the 8 limbs in this case meaning the head, the chest, the hands, the knees, and the feet. This is called the Sashtanga Pranam, the bowing down, touching all of these points to the ground at once. Offering much more devoted worship to my devotees and looking upon all created beings as myself, directing all the movements of one's body to pursuits intended to propitiate me, for example, plucking tulsi leaves and flowers, etc., for my worship, to utter my praises with one's speech, resigning the mind to me and giving up all desires, spurning for my sake wealth as well as the means of enjoyment and self-gratification, and undertaking sacrificial performances, practicing charity, offering oblations into the sacred fire, muttering prayers, observing fasts and other sacred vows, and other austerities, sanctioned by the Shastras, done for my sake. All these are stepping stones to devotion. Devotion, consisting in all-absorbing love for me, the reward of all spiritual endeavors, develops, by following such righteous courses, in the heart of men who dedicate to my service their very self, in the shape of their psychophysical organism as well as all that is connected with it, O Uddhava. What other object remains for such a devotee to be accomplished? Such a devotee's objects are all accomplished as a matter of course, through devotion alone. When the mind equipped with sattva and therefore tranquil is devoted to me, man automatically acquires piety, wisdom coupled with dispassion, and divine powers. When, however, the aforesaid mind is set on various objects, the body, the dwelling, etc., it wanders along with the senses and gets all the more stained with rajas and addicted to evil. And then know it, that a man develops the reverse of piety. That which engenders devotion to me is extolled as dharma. That which enables one to perceive unity everywhere is glorified as wisdom. A distaste for the pleasures of sense is spoken highly of as dispassion, and mystic powers, such as the capacity to assume the size of an atom, etc., are extolled as the divine siddhis. Uddhava submitted, of how many varieties is yama declared to consist, and of how many types is niyama declared to be, O chastiser of foes? What is shama? What does dhamma consist in, O enchanter of beings? What is titiksha, and what is firmness, O Lord? What is charity? What is tapas? What is valor? What is truthfulness, and what is rita? What is tyaga? What is the esteemed wealth? What is yajna, and what goes by the name of dakshina? What is the strength of men, O glorious one? What is fortune, and what is the gain, O ruler of Brahma and Shiva? What is supreme wisdom? What is hri? What is adornment? What is happiness, and what is misery? Who is a man of erudition, and who is a fool? What is the path, and what is the wrong way? What is heaven? What is hell? Who is a friend, and what is the home? Who is opulent, and who is destitute? Who is pitiable, and who is the master of his self? Answer these questions of mine, and to define the contraries, O protector of the virtuous. The glorious Lord replied, harmlessness, uttering only that which is wholesome, agreeable, and true, non-thieving, absence of attachment, modesty, non-accumulation of possessions, faith, chastity, silence, firmness of resolve, forgiveness and fearlessness, bodily cleanliness and mental purity, muttering the Gayatri and other sacred texts, austerity, pouring oblations into the sacred fire, reverence, hospitality, and offering worship to me, visiting sacred places, working for the benefit of others, contentment, and service to the Guru. These have been declared to be the 12 yamas and the 12 niyamas, divided in 2 verses. Carried into practice, they positively yield fruit in the shape of final moksha or worldly prosperity, according to the desire of men, O dear one. Shama is dependence of the intellect on me. Dhamma consists in control of the senses. Titiksha consists in calmly enduring suffering and firmness in completely controlling the palate and the sex. Forswearing enmity towards the entire creation is the highest form of charity. Tapas has been declared to consist in abandoning luxuries. Valor consists in curbing one's natural propensities or cravings, and truthfulness consists in perceiving unity in the form of Brahman everywhere. Rita has been declared by the wise as consisting in truthful and agreeable speech. Shaucha, which is a variety of tyaga when construed in the sense of shaking off impurity, consists in absence of attachment to one's actions, while tyaga is declared as consisting in renouncing the world and entering the order of sannyasa. Righteousness is the esteemed wealth of men. Myself, the Supreme Lord, am the yajna, which should accordingly be performed as identical with myself and not as a dry ritual. Dakshina, the gift made at a yajna, consists in service to the Guru. Pranayama is the supreme strength, inasmuch as it is helpful in curbing the mind. My divine state is real fortune, and devotion to me is the highest gain. Wisdom consists in sublating diversity appearing in the self, and Hari is shrinking from prohibited acts. Adornment consists in virtues like desirelessness. Happiness consists in rising above joys and sorrows, and misery lies in seeking gratification through enjoyment. A man of erudition is he who knows what is bondage and what is liberation. The fool is he who looks upon the body as his self and that connected with it as his. That which leads to my realization has been declared to be the path, and the path of worldly activities, which distracts the mind, is the wrong one. Predominance of sattva guna is heaven. Preponderance of tamoguna is hell. The Guru is one's friend, and he is no other than me, the Jagat Guru, O friend. The human body is the true habitation. He alone who abounds in virtues is said to be opulent. What's meant by the human body is the true habitation. that one's true habitation is not one's house or so on. One should recognize one's body not as oneself, but as a mere temporary habitation. He alone who abounds in virtues is said to be opulent. Destitute is he who is discontented. He is pitiable, who has not been able to control his senses. He is the master of his self, whose mind is not attached to the objects of sense, and he who is attached to the pleasures of sense is a slave. These questions of yours have all been duly answered. What is to be gained by elaborate discussion? In other words, he just obviously gave very brief answers to each of them. The definition of good and evil is as follows. To direct one's eyes to the virtues and faults of others is evil, while virtue lies in developing a disposition entirely free from the habit of seeing the merits and demerits of others. Thus ends the 19th discourse in Book 11 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 20. Jnana Yoga, Karma Yoga, and Bhakti Yoga analyzed. Uddhava submitted, the command of the Almighty Lord, yourself, but in this case referring to the Veda, consists of injunctions and interdictions, and takes into account the good and evil nature of actions as determined by their good and evil consequences, O lotus-eyed one. The Veda further cognizes the distinction of the Varnas and Ashramas, the merits and demerits of those born in the irregular course and those regularly born, the substance, place, age, and time suitable or not suitable for a yajna, as well as Svarga and Naraka, attained as a result of virtuous and sinful actions. How can your word, in the form of the Vedas, consisting as it does of injunctions and interdictions, lead to final moksha without taking into consideration the distinction of good and bad actions? Your word in the form of the Veda is the one excellent eye possessed by the ancestors, gods, and human beings, enabling them to obtain insight into the unseen purpose of life, final moksha, as well as heavenly bliss and so on, as well as into the end to be attained in this very life and the means of attaining it, O Almighty Lord. Knowledge of the distinction between good and evil is derived from your command, and not by itself, and it is by your word that this distinction is negatived. This obviously causes bewilderment in my mind. The glorious Lord replied, 3 yogas in the shape of spiritual enlightenment, disinterested action, and devotion have been taught by me in the sections of the Veda treating of Brahman, ritual acts, the Karma Kanda, and the worship of gods, respectively, with intent to ensure the highest good of men in the shape of liberation by these 3 different possible approaches. No other way is found anywhere in the scriptures. Out of these, the path of jnana is efficacious for those who have lost all charm for the fruit of ritual acts, and accordingly abandon such acts, whereas the path of action, the karma marga, is effectual for those who hanker after their fruit and whose mind has not therefore recoiled from such acts. To the man, however, in whom has sprouted, by stroke of fortune, a zeal for my stories and chanting my name, etc., and who is neither disgusted with the pleasures of sense, nor deeply attached to them, the Bhakti Marga, the path of devotion, brings success in the form of God realization. A man should do his duties so long as he does not get disgusted with the pleasures of sense, or so long as keenness does not appear in him for listening to my stories, etc. A man adhering to his course of conduct and propitiating me through sacrificial performances, but never hankering for their fruit, O Uddhava, neither ascends to heaven nor goes down to perdition unless he perpetrates a prohibited act. Continuing in this body and sticking to his own righteous course, abstaining from sin and thus purged of all impurities in the shape of attachment, etc., he automatically attains pure wisdom in the form of self-realization, or even devotion to me by my grace. In the same way as the denizens of Naraka, heavenly beings too covet an abode in this world, which is favorable for the attainment of wisdom and devotion both, whereas both the aforesaid realms are unhelpful to it, because Naraka is too full of suffering and Svarga too full of sensory pleasures for there to be much impetus for such inner inquiry. A wise man should not long for heaven any more than he should for hell, nor should he long even for being reborn in this world as a human being. Through attachment to a particular body, one generally neglects one's true interests. Alive to this truth, he should diligently strive for cessation of transmigration before death overtakes him, knowing this body to be mortal, though helpful to the attainment of his goal. A bird which is unattached to its abode surely attains happiness on abandoning its abode in the form of the tree on which it has built its nest, which is being cut down by these agents of death. Shuddering with fear to perceive his life being cut short by the passage of days and nights, and free from attachment, the man who has no desire, likewise attains everlasting peace on realizing the supreme. That man kills his soul, so to speak, who, having secured the exceptionally fit vessel of a human body, the source of all blessings and a most rare boon, yet easily obtained without any effort by the grace of God, and piloted by an expert helmsman in the form of a guru, and propelled by a favorable wind in the shape of myself, nevertheless fails to cross the ocean of mundane existence. When, however, a man feels averse to actions and disgusted with their fruit as a source of attachment and consequently of misery, a yogi should, after fully controlling his senses, try to concentrate his mind so as to make it steady through repeated effort at turning it towards the self. When, even while it is being focused on the self, it soon begins to wander due to its habitual vagrancy and becomes unsteady again, one should be on his alert and bring it back under his control by recourse to the method of conciliation and the form of granting it a little freedom. Once it has been brought under control again, he should never allow its movements to go unnoticed, and having controlled his breath and conquered his senses, should reduce his mind to subjection by means of his intellect enriched with sattva. Just as he who seeks to secure the obedience of a horse that has yet to be broken succeeds in taming it only by following its will to some extent in the beginning, repeatedly winning over the mind by recourse to the method of conciliation, as aforesaid, by letting the mind wander a little bit, has been declared to be a ladder to the highest yoga. With a clear knowledge of the ultimate principles enumerated by the Sankhya system of philosophy, he should constantly contemplate in the order of creation the evolution, and in reverse the order, and in the reverse order the involution of all categories, from Mahat-tattva down to his own body, and his own body back up to Mahat-tattva, till his mind becomes still. The mind of a man averse to worldly activity of various kinds, disgusted with the pleasures of this world as well as of the next, and ruminating on what has been taught by his guru, gives up its wickedness in the form of attachment to the pleasures of sense by repeatedly dwelling upon what has already been ruminated upon, meaning the teachings of his guru. The mind should dwell on the Supreme Spirit, the only object worthy of thought, through yama and other yogic processes, through right knowledge in the form of an inquiry into the essential unity of the individual soul and the Supreme Spirit, or through worship of my image or other representation, but never by other methods. If a yogi commits through error a reproachful act, he should burn that sin by recourse to yoga alone, in the form of repeated effort at self-realization, contemplation on me, or chanting of the divine name, etc., and should never resort to any other act in such circumstances. That which is known as strict adherence to one's own individual course has been extolled as a virtue. By making such a demarcation of virtue and fault, restriction has been imposed on actions, which are impure by origin, with the intention of enabling one to shake off attachments to the pleasures of sense. He who has reverence for my stories developed in his heart, and has lost charm for all activities, but not for their rewards, and though recognizing the pleasures of sense to consist of sorrow, is yet unable to relinquish them, should therefore lovingly worship me by means of hearing and chanting my names and stories, etc., full of faith and firm in his conviction that everything will be accomplished through devotion alone, and enjoying those pleasures while condemning them as attended with misery. All the cravings embedded in the heart of the sage constantly worshiping me through the discipline of devotion disappear, I being present in his heart. The knot in the shape of the ego sense in his heart is broken. All his doubts get resolved, and the entire stock of his karma is exhausted the moment I, the soul of the universe, am realized. Therefore, for the yogi who is full of devotion to me and has his mind fixed on me, neither jnana nor even vairagya is generally conducive to blessedness in this world. By recourse to the discipline of devotion to me, my devotee easily attains all that can be had through actions, that which is obtained through ascesis, that which is secured by means of spiritual enlightenment and dispassion, by the practice of yoga, piety in the form of liberality, as well as by recourse to other means of attaining blessedness, such as undertaking a pilgrimage to sacred places or observing fasts, etc. Heaven, final moksha, or residence in my realm, if he so desires, on any account. As a matter of fact, pious men of wisdom, exclusively devoted to me, seek nothing, not even final moksha, characterized by freedom from rebirth, though conferred by me. The wise declare desirelessness to be the greatest and most efficacious way to final moksha. Therefore, devotion to me falls to his lot who does not seek, much less solicit, anything else. Virtue and sin, resulting from good and evil, do not attach to pious souls that are even-minded and exclusively devoted to me, and have attained to me, who stand beyond reason. Those who follow in the aforesaid manner the paths shown by me as leading to me, attain to my realm, which is free from fear, and realize that which is known as the Supreme Brahman. Thus ends the 20th discourse in Book 11 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 21. The process of determining what is good and what is evil, and the secret underlying it. The glorious Lord began again. Abandoning the aforesaid paths leading to me, consisting of devotion, spiritual enlightenment, and action, they who enjoy the trifling pleasures of sense with their fickle senses undergo transmigration. What goes by the name of devotion to one's own duty has been proclaimed to be a virtue. The contrary of it, however, is a fault. Such is the conclusion about the nature of both. Purity and impurity, in this sense meaning fitness for use or something not being fit for use. Virtue and fault, and good and evil consequences are determined in regard to homogeneous substances in order to regulate one's natural proneness to betake oneself to a particular substance by creating a doubt in one's mind about it. Purity and impurity are determined for the purpose of knowing the righteous way as distinguished from the unrighteous. Virtue and fault are defined in order to regulate usage. What is intrinsically good is used in exceptional cases, notwithstanding its impurity. And good and evil consequences are determined in order to enable one to make one's living a sinless one. Such a course of conduct has been shown by me, in the form of Manu and other divine lawgivers, for men bearing the responsibility of upholding the cause of virtue. Earth, water, fire, the air, and ether. These 5 elements, coupled with the self, or the spirit, enter into the constitution of the bodies of all created beings, from Brahma, the foremost of created beings, down to the immobile creation, the lowest species of life. That is to say, all created beings are one, in point of the material stuff of which they are constituted, as well as in point of their jivahood, or spiritual essence. Yet in order to enable these creatures to attain their purpose of life in the form of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha, diverse names and forms are invented by the Vedas with reference to the bodies, though they are made up of the same substance, O Uddhava. In order to regulate the activities of created beings, goodness and otherwise are attributed by me, even to entities like space and time, including the fruit and motive of actions, as well as those qualified for various types of actions, as well as to substances, O most noble one. Of all tracts of land, that which is untrodden by the black deer is unholy more so than that which is lacking in devotion to the Brahmanas. Even that which is hallowed by the presence of the black deer is unholy if destitute of righteous men. The tract known by the name of Kikata, which comprises the territories of Anga, Vanga, and Kalinga, roughly corresponding to the modern district of Bhagalpur in the Indian state of Bihar and the states of Bengal and Utkala, is unholy if not inhabited by good men. The land mostly inhabited by mlechas and barren land is likewise unholy. A period of time which is fit for the performance of righteous actions from the point of view of adequate supply of requisite articles, or by itself, is valuable from that point of view, whereas a period of time in which a sacred rite already commenced has to be abandoned due to scarcity of requisite materials or political upheaval, and even so, that which is declared as unfit for any rite due to impurity occasioned by the death of a blood relation or other near relative, or childbirth in one's own house or family, is impure. The purity and impurity of a substance are brought about by another substance, as well as by the word of mouth, by a purificatory process or an impure process, by flux of time, and by largeness and smallness of area, respectively. By physical fitness and otherwise, or by knowledge in the affluent circumstances or otherwise of the individual concerned. The sin which the aforementioned agencies of pollution bring to a soul by polluting a substance really do so only according to the local conditions and other circumstances of the individual concerned. The purity of food grains, articles of wood, bones, and textiles, savory substances such as milk, ghee, and honey, metals, especially gold, hides and skins and earthen substances, is brought about by the passage of time, air, fire, earth, and water, jointly or severally. These things purify those substances. That by recourse to which an article, such as a stool, household utensil, or cloth, smeared with an impure substance, sheds its foul smell and impure coating, and returns to its natural state, is intended to be its purifier. That's pretty intuitively obvious. If something is dirty, purifying it means physically cleaning it. The purity of a doer prompted by the ego sense is brought about by bathing, munificence, ascesis, age, strength, purificatory rites, and righteous acts like the saying of Sandhya prayers, and above all by remembering me. A member of the twice-born classes, or even a Shudra for that matter, should proceed to do his duty when purified. The purity of a mantra is brought about by learning it properly from a qualified teacher. And the purity of an act lies in dedicating the act to me. Religious merit is acquired through the aforesaid factors, while the reverse makes for unrighteousness. In some cases, even a virtue turns out to be a fault, and vice versa, in the light of a scriptural ordinance. The scriptural ordinance determining the goodness or otherwise of a particular object cuts at the root of the distinction itself. In the case of those fallen in rank or morals, the perpetration of an act similar to that which is sinful for others is not further degrading. Sexual intercourse, when already agreed upon, is a virtue. For a person lying on the ground has no chance of a further fall. A mind is rid of attachment for each of those objects and actions from which he desists. This righteous course, in the shape of detachment, is salutary for men and dispels their grief, infatuation, and fear. From misconception regarding the goodness of an object springs up attachment to it in man. From attachment follows the desire to possess it, and from desire alone ensues quarrel among men. From quarrel proceeds anger, which is difficult to restrain. Infatuation follows anger, and by infatuation is soon obscured man's all-penetrating judgment, distinguishing right from wrong. Deprived of judgment, O good one, the living being is as good as a non-entity. The very purpose of life of such an almost unconscious and dead man is consequently defeated. Due to excessive attachment and longing for the pleasures of sense, he who knows neither himself nor the Supreme lives in vain as if unconscious, like a tree, and breathes like the bellows. In other words, exists mechanically rather than with true purpose. Such a promise of reward in the shape of heaven, etc., contained in the Vedas, does not point out the way to blessedness, but is put forward only to create in the mind, externally inclined, a taste for ritual acts is introductory to an exposition of final moksha, even as before administering a dose of bitter medicine to a stubborn child, a sweet promise is made by parents in order to prevail upon the child to take the dose. Indeed, mortals naturally have their mind attached to objects of desire, such as wealth, cattle, etc., to their life, including their own sense organs, their own physical vitality, virility, etc., as well as to their own people, their children, their wife, and so on, even though they are ultimately sources of bondage to the self. How could the all-knowing Veda direct such men, blind to their real interests and yet devout, convinced about the infallibility of the Vedas, and wandering as a reward of their sacrificial performances in the path of enjoyment, the superhuman species of life, the state of devas and other heavenly beings, and then entering the inanimate forms of life, once more to those very enjoyments? Not knowing such intention of the Vedas, some misguided people interpret the promises of fruit as offering blossoms, but not so the knowers of the real import of the Vedas, sages like Vyasa and others, indeed. Men seeking pleasures of sense and therefore ever miserable, grasping, mistaking the enjoyments of Svarga, which are like so many flowers, as the supreme fruit of human endeavor, confounded by their excessive attachment to ritual acts, and finding the path of smoke at the end of their life, are not able to realize their own self. With ritual acts as the only theme of their talks and intent on gratifying their flesh, they are unable to know me, though present in their heart. Me who am this universe and from whom this universe has sprung up, any more than those whose eyes are bedimmed by mist are able to recognize even that which is close at hand, O dear Uddhava. Not knowing my opinion, which is not quite apparent, and which is to the effect that if one has a passion for destruction of life, it should be restricted to sacrificial performances only, and that there is no scriptural ordinance making it obligatory on us, those wicked men indulging in destruction of life as a pastime, and with their minds set on the pleasures of sense, worship the gods as well as the pitris and the rulers of evil spirits through sacrificial performances carried on by means of animals slaughtered with the desire of gratifying themselves. Picturing to their mind the other world, which is evanescent like the object seen in a dream and a source of misery, though delightful to the ear, and the blessings sought for in this world, they part with their earnings, even as a merchant would stake his fortune. Rooted in Raja, Sattva, and Tamas, they worship devas, etc., Indra being the chief of them, who likewise take delight in Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas, and not so myself. They indulge in the fond hope that, having worshipped the devas through sacrifices in their earthly career, they will ascend to Svarga and revel there, and at the end of such enjoyment in Svarga will be born again in the terrestrial region of a high pedigree and be great householders living in stately mansions. Even the talk bearing on me does not find favor with the egotistic and highly arrogant men who have their mind distracted thus by flowery promises. These Vedas dealing with the three dependents, the ritual acts, the worship of gods, and realization of Brahman, teach as a matter of fact the truth that Brahman alone constitutes the self of us all. The Vedic texts, however, as well as their rishis, convey their meaning indirectly, and hence it is not manifest to all at first sight. And this teaching is dear to me, as well. The meaning of the Veda, which is Brahman manifested in the form of word, the Shabda Brahman, is most difficult to understand, consisting as it does of the vital air, the para stage of speech, the mind, which is the Pashyanti stage, residing in the Anahata chakra, including the Madhyama stage, consisting of Buddhi, or the intellect, residing in the Manipura chakra, and the organ of speech, the Vaikari state of expressed speech. As consisting of the cosmic prana, the Veda is endless in time and limitless in space, profound, obscure, and difficult to fathom like the ocean. Presided over by me, the infinite Brahman possessed of endless potencies, the said Veda is perceived by the wise in the form of the anahata sound, the unstruck sound, in all created beings, like the fiber in a lotus stalk. Even as a spider sends forth the cobweb from its heart through its mouth, the Lord, or through its orifice, the Lord, in the form of Hiranyagarbha, working through the vital air, essentially blissful and appearing in the form of Veda, with the material of the anahata sound, evolves from the cavity of the heart through the mind, which conceives the various sounds represented by the letters of the alphabet, the Vaikari form of speech, flowing in 1,000 channels and embellished with the articulate sounds represented by the letters of the alphabet, classified as sibilants, vowels, aspirants, and semivowels. Manifested out of the one sacred sound, Om, heard in a subtle form within the heart, elaborated by various languages, and characterized by meters, successively consisting of 4 more letters than the preceding and having no limit or end. and himself withdraws it. So thus creation expands through the form of the primal sound, through the Shabda Brahman, and withdraws back. Some of these meters are Gayatri, Ushnik, Anushtubh, Brahati, Pankti, Trashtubh, Jagati, Atichanda, Atyashti, Atijagati, and Ativirat. None in the world other than me knows the heart, the hidden meaning of this sacred speech in the form of the Veda, as to what it lays down in the section dealing with ritual acts, what it reveals through the various mantras in the section dealing with the worship of gods, and what it puts forward by way of hypothesis, and then calls it in question in the section dealing with spiritual knowledge. Me alone in the form of yajna it enjoins in the Karmakanda. Me it names in the Devata Kanda. Whatever objective existence, such as ether, is superimposed on me first and then negatived in the Jnana Kanda is also myself. Taking its stand on me as the cause of all causes and the highest reality, the Veda posits diversity as a mere illusion and then, denying it, ultimately becomes quiet. This much is the import of all the Vedas. Thus ends the 21st discourse in Book 11 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. Discourse 22. Categories enumerated and distinction between Prakriti and Purusha. Uddhava submitted, how many are the categories or fundamental principles enumerated by the rishis, O ruler of the universe? You, for your part, have referred to 9, 11, 5, and 3, 28 categories in all, O Lord, as we have heard. Some, however, speak of 26 categories, others of 25. Some declare 7, 9, 6, and 4, respectively, while others mention 11. Some declare 17, others 16, and others 13. With what intention do the sages severally declare such a large variety of numbers? Be pleased, O eternal Lord, to tell us this. The glorious Lord replied, whatever the Brahmanas well versed in the Vedas declare is but right, for all categories stand included in all other categories. What is there hard to establish for those who make their assertion, accepting the potency of my Maya? My potency is in the form of the three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, appearing as so many modifications of the mind, which are so difficult to overcome, are at the back of those wrangling over the cause in the following strain. It is not quite as you say, what I say is correct. Diversity in the form of this universe, which is the subject of controversy among the disputants, follows from the disturbance of equilibrium of these potencies. When control of the mind and subjugation of the senses are attained, the diversity disappears and the controversy is set at rest as a sequel to it. The categories being comprised in one another, O jewel among men, they are enumerated as more or less according to the viewpoint of the speaker. In a single category, whether it is a cause or an effect, are found comprised all other categories. Therefore, we accept as conclusive whatever is stated according to one's own viewpoint by any one of those disputants seeking to establish the relation as cause and effect, or a definite number of categories, there being a cogent reason behind every such assertion. Self-realization in the case of the jiva, characterized by ignorance that has no beginning, cannot take place by itself, and is possible only through instructions imparted by another omniscient being. There must be another being who knows the truth and is able to impart his knowledge to the jiva. There is not the least difference in this body between the individual soul and God, both being of the nature of pure consciousness. Therefore, the assumption that they are distinct from one another is meaningless. And knowledge, or self-realization, is but a function of sattva guna, a constituent of prakriti. Hence, it is not necessary to recognize the 26th category in the shape of God in order to rationalize the possibility of self-realization. Prakriti is only another name for the state of equilibrium of the three gunas. Therefore, sattva, rajas, and tamas, which are severally responsible for the continuance, appearance, and disappearance of the universe, are the adjuncts of prakriti and not of the spirit being a non-doer, and hence, knowledge, according to this classification, is spoken of as a modification of sattva, action as a modification of rajas, and ignorance as a modification of tamas. All three of which are comprised in prakriti. Hence, action and ignorance too are included in prakriti. And so By that method, you would end up with fewer categories. Again, time is no other than God. And Svabhava is the Mahatattva, the principle of cosmic intelligence, which is all-powerful. Hence, it is not necessary to multiply categories in both these classifications. Of the 28 categories mentioned, in 4 groups of 9, 11, 5, and 3, respectively, the last 3, the 3 gunas, which are included by others in Prakriti, have thus been enumerated. Of the remaining 25, Purusha, the spirit comprising God as well as the individual soul, both of which are conscious by nature, Prakriti, Mahatattva, Ahankara, ether, the air, fire, water, and earth in their gross form, these are the 9 categories referred to by me. The faculties of cognition, the senses of hearing, touch, sight, smell, and taste, the organs of action, the organ of speech, hands, the organ of generation, the organ of defecation, and feet, and the mind, the controller of both, the varieties of sense objects, sound, touch, taste, smell, and color. These are the other 11 and 5 categories, which I mentioned. Locomotion and speech, urination and defecation, and handicraft are the functions of the organs of actions, and could be considered not as separate categories, because they are just the functions of some of the other categories. Appearing in the form of the 16 evolutes, the 5 gross elements, the 10 indriyas in the mind, and the 7 causal principles, the Mahatattva, Ahankara, and the 5 objects of sense. Indeed, Prakriti, being the material cause of all these, undergoes the state of being created, etc., through Sattva and the other gunas, at the time of creation, etc., of this visible universe, whereas the immutable Purusha, being the efficient cause, looks on as a mere witness. Energized by a glance from the Purusha and united with one another, fundamental principles like Mahatattva, which enter into the constitution of the universe, undergoing transformation, bring forth the cosmic egg with the help of Prakriti, their source. According to the view that the fundamental principles are only 7, the 5 elements beginning with ether, the principle of consciousness, the subject or jiva, and the universal spirit, the ground of both the subject and the object, these are the 7 categories, Prakriti being included in its evolutes. From the above named 7 categories spring up the body, the indriyas, as well as the vital airs. Similarly, according to the view that the fundamental principles are 6 only, they are the 5 elements, the 6th being the Supreme Person. Having evolved this objective universe in conjunction with the elements, sprung from himself, he enters it as its inner controller. According to this view, all objective existences should be taken as covered by the 5 elements and the individual soul by the universal spirit. Even according to the view that the categories are 4 only, they are fire, water, and earth evolved from the spirit. Prakriti and the other causal principles should be recognized here as included in their 3 evolutes enumerated in this verse, and the other 2 elements, ether and air too, likewise included in them. By means of the aforesaid 4 categories, indeed has this evolution of the universe taken place. According to the view which enumerates 17 principles, they are the 5 elements, the 5 tanmatras, and the 5 senses of perception, along with the 1 mind, and the Atma, which includes the individual soul as well as the universal spirit, being recognized as the 17th. Likewise, according to the view which enumerates 16 categories, the Atma itself is spoken of as the mind. Again, according to the view which recognizes only 13 categories, the 5 elements, including the 5 tanmatras, so both the gross and subtle forms get lumped together, and the same number of senses that reveal them, the mind and the twofold spirit, the individual soul and the universal spirit, constitute the 13 principles. According to the view restricting the number of categories to 11, they comprise the aforesaid Atma, which includes the individual soul as well as the mind, the 5 gross elements, and the 5 senses. Similarly, according to the view recognizing 9 categories only, the 8 causal principles, the 5 elements, the mind, the intellect, and the ego, and the Purusha are the 9 categories, the evolutes being included within their causes. Thus, the same fundamental principles have been enumerated in different ways by the rishis. All that reckoning is justified, supported as it is by reason. What is their unbecoming on the part of the wise? In other words, none of these different models actually disagree with each other about the nature of reality. They just categorize it differently for purposes of talking about it. Uddhava submitted, Although both Prakriti and Purusha are essentially distinct one from the other, their diversity is not perceived, O Krishna, because of their interrelation. The spirit is seen in the body alone, and Prakriti too is seen in the self. Be pleased, O lotus-eyed one, to resolve the grave doubt in my mind in this matter by your clever words supported with reason, O omniscient Lord. Since enlightenment in this world comes to the jivas through you, and the obscuration of knowledge follows from your energy in the shape of avidya, therefore you alone know the course of your own maya, and none else. The glorious Lord replied, Prakriti and Purusha, there is a radical difference between the two, O jewel among men. This psychophysical organism, which is a product of Prakriti, undergoes numerous changes in the course of its existence, inasmuch as it owes its existence to a disturbance in the equilibrium of the three gunas, while the soul is absolutely changeless. My Maya, O loved one, consisting as it does of the three gunas, creates by means of those gunas differences as well as the manifold notions of difference. Though limitless in variety, this changeable universe is, broadly speaking, threefold in character. One variety is adhyatma, the next is adhidaiva, and the third is adhibhuta. The sense of sight, for example, falls under the category of adhyatma, since it's part of the perceived self, the experience of consciousness. Color, the object of the sense of sight, is adhibhuta, meaning the material object, and the solar element existing in the organ of sight, which enables it to perceive light, is adhidaiva, or the process of knowing. Every one of these three depends for its existence on the other two. That which exists in the sky, being self-existent, is independent of these three. The orb of the sun, in this case. Since the Atma, being the cause of all these, the Adhyatma, etc., is their witness and therefore different from them, therefore, by virtue of its own self-existent conscious nature, illumines all illuminating agents. Just as the eye has been shown above to have these three aspects, the tactile sense, the auditory sense, the palate, the olfactory sense, as well as the intellect, the mind, the ego, and the faculty of reason also should be similarly understood to possess the same threefold character. The modification evolved out of the Mahatattva, which has its root in Prakriti, through the instrumentality of Kala, the time spirit, or God, who is responsible for disturbing the equilibrium of the gunas, Ahankara, and which is of three kinds, Vaikarika, Tamasika, and Aindriya, lies at the root of the notion of difference brought into being by ignorance about the self. The controversy whether the self as distinguished from the body exists or not is the result of not realizing the self. Though meaningless, inasmuch as it is capable of being set at rest by self-realization, it does not cease this controversy of whether the self exists apart from the body, does not cease in the case of men whose mind is turned away from me, their real self. Uddhava submitted. Tell me, O protector of cows, how men whose mind is turned away from you take and give up corporeal forms high and low in conformity with actions performed by themselves, O Lord. How the omnipresent self could pass from one body to another, how actions could be ascribed to the actionless, and how birth and death could be attributed to that which is beyond birth and death. It is a thing which cannot be easily conceived by men of poor understanding, for generally speaking, there are none in the world who are conversant with this topic, deluded as people are. The glorious Lord replied, united with the five senses, as well as with the five organs of action and the five subtle elements, the mind of the jivas, consisting as it does of latencies of karma, travels from one body to another, and the soul, though distinct from it, follows it, identified as it is with that mind. Being under the sway of karma, which determines the nature of future existence, the mind contemplates at the dying moment objects seen or heard of, and being reborn in the midst of those objects, gets insensible to his present surroundings. The memory, too, of his present life ceases when the present life ends. When through deep attachment for identification with a new body, the mind no longer remembers the previous body, this complete forgetfulness of a jiva about the body with which he was identified until its last moment brought about by some reason or other in the shape of the prarabdha karma, which kept him tied down to the previous body, having been exhausted, constitutes what is described as his death. And the wise declare the birth of a jiva to consist in completely identifying himself with a particular body, just as a dream and a reverie consist in one's identifying oneself with the body appearing in a dream or in a reverie, O giver of plenty. Just as the jiva identified with the present body no longer remembers the preceding one, the dreaming soul or the soul drowned in a reverie no longer remembers the body of a preceding dream or a preceding reverie. He visualizes himself, though old, as if it had newly come into existence. Due to the coming into existence of a body, or due to the appearance in another setting of the mind, a threefold distinction in the form of the mind, senses, and body appears in the one self, as a result of which the self becomes the occasion for internal and external differences, just as a jiva assumes a number of undesirable bodies in the course of a dream and appears manifold, or just as a man begetting a number of wicked children, though one assumes different relations with reference to the friends and enemies, etc., of those children and appears diversified. As a matter of fact, O dear Uddhava, the bodies of created beings come into existence and perish every moment by action of time, whose velocity is too subtle to be perceived. And it is due to this subtlety that their appearance and disappearance in quick succession every moment are not seen. As in the case of flames of lamps, the currents of streams, and the fruits of a tree, so in the case of all created beings, their age, condition, etc., are determined by time. Just as the notion entertained and assertion made about a series of flames arising and disappearing in one place, in place of one another, that this is the same flame, or about the particles of water flowing one after another in a stream, that this is the same water, are false. So it is the unwise alone that entertain the notion and make the assertion about bodies arising and disappearing in place of one another at the same spot, that this is the same body. Even such an ignorant jiva is neither born nor dies as a result of its karma continuing in the form of a seed. Yet through illusion, in the form of false identification with the body, it appears to be born and to die, as it were, just as fire appears to come into existence and die through illusion. Entry into the womb, gestation and birth, infancy, childhood, youth, middle age, old age, and death. These are the 9 states of the body. These states, high and low, brought about by one's own desire, of course, of a body, a certain individual soul accepts as one's own through false identification with matter, while another with great difficulty disowns them by grace of God. One's own birth can be inferred from the birth of one's son and death from that of one's father. The knower of things subject to birth and death can never be subject to birth and death himself. He who comes to know the sprouting of an annual plant from its seed and its end from being shriveled up after yielding its fruit, such a seer is distinct from the plant. Even so, the seer of a body is distinct from the body. Therefore, he who knows these states of the body is not affected by them, though dwelling in the body. Failing to distinguish the spirit from matter in the aforesaid manner and getting deeply attached to the pleasures of sense as the only reality, the ignorant jiva undergoes transmigration. Made to revolve in the whirl of rebirth by his actions, a man attains to the regions of devas and rishis through application to virtues born of sattva guna, like control of the mind and the senses, to the subterranean regions of asuras and human beings, through devotion to lust, etc., born of rajoguna, and ascends to realms of spirits and to the scale of subhuman creatures or immobile creation through close application to grief and infatuation, etc., born of tamoguna. Just as a man who sees others dancing and singing tries to imitate them, so the soul, though actionless, is made to follow the movements of the body, prompted by the intellect, when it sees them and takes them to be its own. Just as by the side of moving water, the trees also appear as though moving, reflected in the water. The activity, etc., of the body are reflected in the self. And just as when the eye is made to revolve along with our body, the earth around us too is seen as though revolving along with us. The excellences attributed to the objects of senses by the perceiving mind appear to exist in them, though not actually existing, since the excellences in the object are purely a subjective value judgment and not an objective reality. Just like the experiences of a reverie or those of a dream Our sense experiences, as well as our identification with the body, etc., are false, O scion of Dasharaha. Even though pleasurable and painful experiences do not belong to the soul, suffering entailed by metempsychosis does not cease for him who dwells on the pleasures of sense as something enjoyed by the self, any more than calamities cease to befall a dreaming man till he is fully awake. Therefore, Uddhava, do not enjoy the pleasures of sense with your vile senses, which are so difficult to gratify. Look upon the varied experiences, both of the pleasurable and painful type, as illusory, and as reflected in the soul because of our ignorance about its true nature, as the ground of all experiences. Whether reproached or insulted, ridiculed or belittled, beaten or tightly bound, etc., or deprived of one's means of livelihood, literally spat or urinated upon by the wicked, and thus shaken in many ways from one's fixity in the self by the ignorant, and even when reduced to dire straits, a seeker of blessedness should try to redeem oneself by recourse to reason. Uddhava submitted, "Pray tell us, O jewel among speakers, how I should get enlightened thus. I regard such outrage to oneself by the wicked as most difficult to bear even for the knowing, except of course those who are engaged in duties pleasing to you, and have found shelter in your feet, and whose passions have been stilled. For nature in the form of tendency to revolt against ill treatment is indeed very powerful, O soul of the universe." Thus ends the 22nd discourse in Book 11 of the great and glorious Bhagavata Purana, otherwise known as the Paramahansa Samhita. And I think that's probably a good pausing point for today, since it is just after 10, and the next discourse, Krishna gets into a story by way of answer to Uddhava's question.
Thank you, Devula.
Yeah, thank you guys for coming.
Thank you, Devula. Hey, Dr. N.
Yeah.
Hello, Andy. I'm excited to see you all when I come. I think, unfortunately, I'll miss you, Andy, because you're leaving.
Oh, what day are you coming